Now I want to bring out our other panelists. I'd like to ask, first of all, Mayor Paes to return. Mindy Lubber, the president of Ceres, a nonprofit organization that leads a national coalition of investors, environmental organizations, and other public interest groups working with companies to meet sustainability challenges, including climate change and water scarcity. She also directs the Investor Network on Climate Risk, a group of over 100 institutional investors managing $10 trillion in assets. Ruth Porat is the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Morgan Stanley. She's going to have to finance all this for us. Judith Rodin is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Before that, was the president of the University of Pennsylvania, and before that, the provost of Yale. She is the first woman ever selected to head an Ivy League institution, and she is the first woman to serve as the Rockefeller Foundation's president in its about-to-be, soon, 100-year history. She has taken an uncommon interest in this whole notion of building resilient cities. And so I want to thank them all for being here and say that one of our luncheon participants said that he had once been reprimanded by former Vice President Gore in a friendly way when we were all working together on climate change when I was president, and most people thought we were alarmists. When Al Gore and I agreed to the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty in '97, the Senate voted against it 95-0 before he got off the airplane coming from Japan. I told everybody it is the only bill I ever lost in Congress before I sent it to them. Now, presumably, the level of denial is markedly lower and somewhat more confined. But the interesting thing to me is, to go back to what was said, is that our level of denial was pretty bad too back in the 90s, only on one issue. We didn't want to talk about building resilient cities because we still entertained the notion that we could roll back the oceans, so we could stop the rise in ocean levels because of rising temperatures. Now we know we have to be both aggressive and intelligent in combating climate change, and we have to make our most vulnerable communities more resilient to its manifestations. And so that's what we want to talk about today. Again, I thank the mayors for being here. I thank Mayor Bloomberg for his commitment as the leader of the C40. And I'm looking forward to discussing this more when we get to Rio. I promise you everyone has thought about it. One of the most interesting things that came out of the work that I did with the first President Bush in the aftermath of Katrina, and the work we did here on Katrina and CGI, was supporting the project that Brad Pitt and Bill McDonough did to rebuild houses in the lower Ninth Ward, which were both more sustainable and more resilient. They basically built up, dug down, and used dramatically improved and recycled materials so that we not only made them safer, those houses, and insurable again, but we gave them the lowest electric bills they had ever paid. And since the Ninth Ward was full of people who worked hard for modest incomes, to me it was a microcosm of what we should and could be doing around the world. Having said that, let's go to the panel and give them the last word. Mayor Paes. I know your answer to this because we just had lunch, but they don't. When most people think of Rio, if they've never been there, they think of your magnificent statue, and they think of Sugarloaf Mountain, and they think of Ipanema Beach. And if they're old like me, they remember when jazz and samba melded there in the 60s. What keeps you up? What do you worry? We know how successful Brazil is. We know that the economy's grown like crazy. We know that after decades of being famous for its wild income inequality, that Brazil, unlike the United States, has actually reduced income inequality while reducing child poverty and growing the economy. What do you worry about? Tell the audience what your current environmental challenges are.
I mean, Mr. President, again, we still got Ipanema. We still got great songs. Still is a party city. But as every big city in the world is becoming more and more urbanized, we face the challenge of climate change much more than we could think of. I mean, actually, this morning, I was telling you that by lunchtime, we had major winds, like 100 kilometers wind in Rio, the day that the mayor is out. I'm coming back tomorrow, which completely got us from surprise. So what we've been trying to do is what most of the mayors all over the world are trying to do these days is how can we prepare our cities, not completely to be ready for the natural phenomena that happens, but what can we do to make our cities more resilient? So, I mean, there are many experiences. You could see what Mayor Bloomberg did here during Sandy. I mean, you could go to great experiences of San Francisco dealing with earthquakes or getting ready for their earthquake. You could see experiences as we do in Rio. I mean, having a control operation center where you get all the departments together to have a more immediate response. But what really make me stay up at night is the danger of losing lives, people that live in slopes, in high risky areas, because of housing problems, and not having the capability most of the times to predict that and to give the right response. So, I mean, and I think, obviously, if you go to third world countries or developing countries or countries in the southern hemisphere, this problem gets worse. But that's something that every city, it's from New York to London, to Paris, to Johannesburg, to Rio, to Buenos Aires, every city faces this kind of problem these days. And I think all the mayors all over the world, they kind of don't sleep because of that.
Mayor Bloomberg, same question. One of the things that surprised me when I became a New Yorker is how much of New York is below the ground. Not below sea level, below the earth. I've read countless books about the complexity of this great and wonderful place. So what do you worry most about because of the projected future problems with climate change? Are there problems that will occur above the earth or below the earth? Are they the risks to the infrastructure publicly held or to private buildings? What do you worry most about?
Well, Sandy was a flood. We had very little wind damage. It was that there was a tidal surge. It was a full moon. It was a hurricane coming up the coast and a northeaster which pulled it sharply towards the west, and it hit south of us, which was the worst combination you could possibly have, because if you have a low-pressure area, the winds go counterclockwise around the low-pressure area, and so we were on the northeastern part of the hurricane when it hit, and that drove the tidal surge up the harbor and along the Rockaways, Coney Island, Breezy Point, and Staten Island. And people didn't lose their houses. There were actually only about 500 that were totally destroyed. Most of these people, however, lost everything in them, certainly everything in the basement, which typically was their electric service, their hot water, and their heaters. And so the houses became unlivable, and it was in the middle of the winter or going into the winter. Cold showers are fun for a day or so if you're in the Army, but after that, People had to find another ways to get a shower and to cook and that sort of thing. We have the potential, I suppose, for an earthquake. We did have one last year, but we're not on a fault zone, so that's not likely to be big. But if it is, if we were to have one, we have an enormous amount of infrastructure underground. All our water comes from two different aqueducts and then 3 tunnels, the third of which we're about to open in the city. If those were to collapse, the city's uninhabitable. You cannot let people live someplace where they can't flush their toilets and the fire department doesn't have water to put out a fire. So you have that. We have in the air, we are to the downwind of most of the country. 13,000 Americans die every year from pollutants from coal-fired power plants, 800 of them in New York. And so our people are getting killed every day. Nobody notices it because it comes on you slowly and you don't know exactly why. Mercury in the water supply is another thing. It's those kinds of things. And then you have terrorist attacks, whether it is a bomb, which wouldn't do, I don't think, too much damage generally, although the World Trade Center showed just how vulnerable we really are. But it would scare people, and people have to believe that they're safe. And then you have cyber attacks, which could destroy our civilization as we know it, at least stop it for a while. There's almost nothing we do that in this day and age, and every day gets more and more, tied into the same network of communications. And for all of the resiliency and backup that we talk about, eventually somebody's going to find a ways to take down an electrical network or stop all elevators from working or things like that, and those could be very dangerous and damaging to our economy as well as to life. Other than that, there's no, our crime rate is way down.
I recommend that we flee from the room and lock ourselves in the nearest closet right now.
But those are the kinds of things we have to prepare for.
Thank you.
I want to know what it is. It is.
I agree. Judith, the Rockefeller Foundation has had a variety of projects directed against some of the adverse consequences of all these changes in the weather. One of them, my foundation, we had the honor to work with you on a reforestation project in Guyana, which I think is the most successful one in the world to date. Amazing. And but you had a geographically confined area that was densely populated with forests already, with a government that was 100% committed to doing what had to be done. Now, it's a long stretch from that to taking on this whole issue of resilience of cities. Why are you interested in this? And realistically, what can those of us in the civil society sector, the NGOs, hope to accomplish? Even one as well endowed as the Rockefeller Foundation. How can you deal with this?
Well, we see actually the link, and you mentioned reforestation. Think about the challenges where you have the intersection of climate change, urbanization, and increasing vulnerability. As more and more people pour into cities, we look at the current statistic, which is about 50% of the world's population in cities. That's going to be 75% globally by 2050 at the latest, and 80 or 90% of that is going to happen in the developing world. So the way that we focus on climate change projects, whether it's deforestation to reforestation, whether we finally do something about carbon and carbon emissions, all of these will ultimately impact people and cities. So our effort is really first to issue a clarion call in cities about the importance of building resilience to the climate shocks that we can no longer work merely to mitigate because they're shocks that have already occurred, and to think really intentionally about how we include planning for the most vulnerable among us, and that is what civil society often plays a very key role in doing. We saw in Sandy, we saw in New Orleans, we saw in the Japanese tsunami. The people who are most severely impacted are those who are the most vulnerable. They're living in the most vulnerable regions. Many of the cities in the world that are subject to climate change are on coastlines or river deltas or lakes that will overflow, and it's often, maybe aside from South Florida, the poorest people who live in many of those areas. And so how we do build resilience, both at the individual level, at the level of communities, at the level of institutions, business, and other kinds of institutions, are really going to be, we think, the critical 21st century question. And we're going to have to undo a lot of what's done. If you think about the Bangkok floods, what came out afterwards is that in the name of economic development, highways were built over the canals that were naturally running canals through Bangkok for centuries. But they needed to develop further highway systems for Bangkok, and so they weren't able to clear the flooding in the way. We, in the earlier history of the United States, diverted the Mississippi. We produced part of the problem in addition to climate change that we saw in Katrina when the levees failed. So we're going to have to take action to really think about the implications of former economic development strategies, current economic development strategies, as well as specific climate and resilience strategies if we're to protect people going forward.
You, don't forget this. If we got enough time, I want to come back to this about what do we have to stop doing? Do we have to stop building in some places, undo the building and all that? But I want Ruth and Mindy to talk a minute. In any normal time, if we weren't coming out of this huge global financial crisis and we weren't having all these arguments we're having, the portion of this that should be done in public infrastructure, and maybe even a lot of the private building portion, would be financed through tax-exempt bonds, particularly in the U.S. and Germany and one or two other places where interest rates are lower than inflation, screaming at us to do this. But on the assumption that we're not about to do it right now, is there enough private capital out there to do what needs to be done to build resilience and a more sustainable infrastructure? And if so, what do people need to know to put the deals together to make them attractive to those of you who can finance it?
There's a lot of capital, private capital available, but it's not enough. So let me try and deal with the two pieces. There's been about $250 billion of equity capital raised from the private sector over the last decade. That finances about $1 trillion worth of projects. About 30% of that is left, so $300 billion worth of projects, sizable number. And the good news, very much to your point, we're in a low growth, low interest rate environment. There continues to be a lot of investment interest, and that number is expected to grow fivefold over the next decade. Now, what the private sector looks for, and this is predominantly pension fund money, so looking for stability of returns, low risk-adjusted returns. So they focus on what's the revenue, is it a long duration, 30-year type project or more, but then an entire portfolio of risks that need to be quantified. And one is counterparty risk, which is difficult to deal with, but two, go very much to Judith's comment, it's about climate risk and it's political risk. The one thing that investors don't want is to be caught in the middle of a political debate. Is the project going to get pulled right before it gets to the finish line? Or is there a difference in opinion about what should go into the project? So for example, it is very logical to assume in certain areas that you would build into a project the need to engineer against climate threats. We don't know when the climate problem is going to come, when the flood will come, but you better build that building so that it can resist it. That may cost more in the short term, but medium to the long term, it's the right thing to do. And you need to have a shared vision about that so that anyone bidding on that project has it mandated into the proposal and you're not in the middle of a political debate thereafter. So there are ways to reduce the risk of any project with a shared vision, delineating how we're going to solve it as part of the overall proposal. But to your question, that's a good chunk of money, no doubt, but given the magnitude of the infrastructure issues globally, I still think it's fair to say we need to find ways to continue to access some of the public sector financing, of which there's quite a bit today. I mean, here in the States, we have a terrific program, one of the few that still has bipartisan support in the transportation area, transportation infrastructure financing. TIFIA. There's discussion, we'll extend it to water. To the extent we can encourage our legislators to extend these types of programs, you just magnify what the private sector does want to do, which is continue to invest in infrastructure and do it now.
Mindy?
Well, we're using a couple of words here, risk and opportunity. And as it relates to climate change, as we all know, clearly financial markets live by and die by risk. But the risk that we're talking about as it relates to climate change is not only financial risk, it is national security risk, it's environmental risk, it's public health risk. It is an issue, the magnitude of which ought to tie us all together. So I think the risks are more than financial. I want to come back and talk about the opportunity. The opportunity of what we're here to talk about today, resilience, how do we protect our cities, is the perfect opportunity to bring the largest possible group together. We all have a stake. People act when they've got a stake in it. Somehow this issue of climatic-related damage has become an East Coast, West Coast, progressive states, Democrat versus Republican issue. We all know better. We know that when our cities, when our homes, when our communities, when our countries are being impacted in the most inhumane way, the financial risk, the human risk, the public health risk are more than anything any of us are about. And when we look at our cities, we look at what happens to the corner bank and to the corner subway station, or the fact that the New York Stock Exchange was shut down during Mayor Bloomberg's challenge of Hurricane Sandy. There was nobody who was not harmed. When we have sat with insurance companies and investors and cities and companies and communities and talked about how do we rebuild our cities, it is the most uniting issue. It is something that has brought together people, and I don't know if they're Democrats or Republicans or from Iowa or from California. But I know that they saw what happened and they know it's real. If anything, Hurricane Sandy or Katrina told us these issues matter to every one of us. And what we've seen is banks looking at how to change their financing, cities looking at how to change their zoning to make sure that buildings aren't being built on waterfront that are ignoring the impacts of climate change. We're looking at local pension funds who are committing more money to put money into communities. We're looking at Bank of America a couple months ago saying they're going to put $50 billion into climate and sustainable energy, or Citigroup, or every one of the financial institutions. People understand the risk of climate, whether it's the $40 billion to the insurance sector in 2011 or $35 billion in 2012, or the $50 billion in payouts, or the crop insurance and flood insurance that we're each paying for as the federal government because the insurance industry is no longer insuring those things. The cost is enormous, and the opportunities for mitigating that cost are enormous. But it will take all of us, and it will take addressing, mitigating the problem as well as restoring our cities. And that means passing carbon legislation in the United States, putting a price on carbon, having an international treaty where we really can come together and make sure we mitigate the problem as well as prepare for it.
Mandy, I was going to say, I think the New York Stock Exchange is a great example. They did have generators. They did take all the precautions. They could have opened and functioned fine. Plenty of backup. They closed because government didn't make our transportation system, which is state-run, didn't make it sustainable. And so they said, well, people can't get to work. But the private sector did what we would ask them to do. It was in their interest. The trouble is that when you get to the government level, they don't ever want to go to the public and say, if you want to buy something down the road, you got to pay for it now. And the fact that they're not going to be there at a ribbon cutting when it's done is a great disincentive to make the kind of investments. And when the economy goes south, we always walk away from investments. The city did that in the 70s, and it took us decades to work our ways out.
Do you believe this project that you announced today, the C40 Commitment, will help to do this?
Yeah, I think it does, because it gives legitimacy. If you argue for taking some steps to make your city more resilient, you can say, and look, we are rated here so poorly, and then people aren't going to buy our bonds, and it gives the legislators something to hang their hats on, an independent measure of what the risks are. And there's always somebody who says, oh, that's not really a risk. There's always somebody that says, I don't believe in the climate change. There's always somebody that says, it didn't take 7 days to 6 days to create heaven and earth. Therefore, you just have to have some outside independent verification. And I think a number that came up was drawn up by an independent body carries an enormous amount of weight. It's like a rating on your bonds. People believe it.
Let me make a comment on that. I mean, listening to what Mayor Bloomberg said now and what Judith said before, I mean, this is a political issue. I mean, if you go to cities like Rio, let's give the example of my city. I mean, you had the housing problem, so for a long time, Rio just let people, Rio's a city full of mountains, so people build their homes in the favelas, in the slums of Rio, and these are very risky areas. I mean, if you have an independent index, as Mayor Bloomberg announced it today, at a certain point, I mean, taking some people out of these hills, of these mountains in Rio, there would be not anymore a political or electoral issue as it is these days. It still is. I mean, even civil society, that's why I make the reference to what Judith said. I mean, even the civil society, the NGOs, I mean, they could understand that most of the time when you're talking about taking some people out of their homes that are in the hills or the slopes, the mountains, it's because you want to save their lives. Because there's no way you can save their lives if there's big flood. I mean, Rio has a history of, like almost every summer, there's someone dying because of landslides. And, I mean, people still think that is something that you could fix. I mean, obviously, you can do forestation, you can do works to contain the landslides, but most of the time, it's risky, and you got to take people over there. So it has to become a political issue. It has to be independent. It cannot be, I mean, Republican or Democrat.
I want to ask Judith to comment on this because the Rockefeller Foundation's mission includes helping the poor and vulnerable. But this is a huge problem. That one of the problems we have with Haiti being effectively in the hurricane belt coming up is that you've got 3 million people, give or take, living in the Port-au-Prince area, and it's a bowl built for 200,000 to 300,000. And so how do we not only assess the risks there so that you can figure out if you want to finance a housing development or whatever else, but how do we take account of this? Because I love the fact that none of our people in New York were willing to let a land rush occur in the Rockaways. That this area that was damaged by this hurricane, it's probably the longest stretch of wide beach in America, still occupied by real middle-class Americans of very modest incomes. And there was this overwhelming consensus that we weren't going to change the character of it. It wasn't going to become, that was touching. But now that we decided that, we got to figure out how to insure them and how they can build to merit that. That's doubly hard on the hillsides of Rio, where the favelas are, and in Port-au-Prince, where we had things skating down the earthquake, skating literally 300 feet down a mountain. So,
well, you mentioned the Rockaways, so let's start there. We have local community authority in each of those villages in the Rockaways, and 4 years ago, the Army Corps of Engineers recommended building high sand dunes as part of restoring and protecting the natural infrastructure that might be a buffer against storm surges. 5 of the 7 communities elected to do it, and 2 did not. And when you walked that beach on the days after Sandy, you really saw the implications of that decision. It's not that others didn't have flooding, but the 2 communities that had really the most devastation were those who didn't build the dunes. So we have got to engage our people. This is about initially assessing the risk, but also giving people not only the information, but the capacity to figure out what they need to do themselves. And often we find we have 46 resilience building projects in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Thailand alone. And in all of them, there is really deep community engagement because often the communities really do understand what it will take to protect themselves. So let's take Da Nang, which is a coastal community that gets repeated flooding. Working with the most vulnerable in those communities, we supported building more resilient roofs so that the roofs wouldn't blow off and the flooding, which usually comes not from the bottom but from the top there, wouldn't affect these families twice a year when they would have to move out and really lose their livelihoods. Or working with the subsistence fishermen in Da Nang who go out repeatedly during the worst typhoons, lose their boat, and then their family's devastated for the next year. We asked them not to go out, and they said that's when the fishing's the best, because the churning of the seas is really what produces the great fishing. So instead of trying to convince them to stop fishing, we developed a project with them of electric winches and early warning systems so that they could stay out really long, and then the electric winches would pull the boats in really quickly, get them all in, and allow them to have a more resilient livelihood and not be influenced by their vulnerability. So this is a combination of government and the private sector and people themselves. And so you ask what you can do. You can be people who are advocating for these kinds of efforts in your cities and your communities and really holding one another as well as your government and business accountable.
Ruth?
One of the very productive things we've found is really working across silos. So the least advantaged are dealing with a number of challenges at once. And an example, in San Francisco, we invested in transit-oriented affordable housing. The issue is there was a lack of affordable housing. Affordable housing wasn't near mass transit. The poorest couldn't get to work. And by bringing together a couple of disciplines, a couple of different ways, cutting through silos, affordable housing, transit, and even activity centers that support those communities, you were addressing the weakest in that community. And we found that brought additional capital in and was a way to actually layer philanthropic money with private sector money to build a more resilient community, resilient to the economic climate in which you operate, and also dealing with carbon footprint because you're dealing with the access to transit. So again, cross-siloed solutions to problems are another important way to look at it.
Incidentally, it also made projects more likely to pay off, didn't it?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that a little more now. Mindy, of all the things that Ceres partner networks have invested in, what do you think is the most important thing you've learned here to make this climate change work investable and successful?
Well, the first thing is that climate change is not an environmental issue. When we sit down we work with 89 Fortune 500 companies and 105 investors whose assets total $10 trillion. This is a financial issue that all of us need to get behind. When I was at the Gap in the boardroom, they looked at what the loss of the cotton crop from the drought in Texas meant to their share value. Loss of 4% right off the top. Or Jones Lang LaSalle, what some of these storms meant to their real estate. The most exciting thing that I'm seeing is the private sector saying we need to engage on this issue, we need to work with investors and civil society, and we need to do a number of things. We need to change our carbon footprint. Microsoft 6 months ago gave everybody who worked there a carbon budget. If you go over your budget, you can't travel. You got to stay put. There are thousands of companies. eBay moved their data centers so they could be powering them with solar energy. Baxter, the healthcare company in the Midwest, 22% of their energy now comes from renewable. They're moving to 80%. We are seeing Disney massively change their water usage because McKinsey tells us we'll have 30% less water than we need around the world due to climate and other changes. So the most exciting thing that I'm seeing, Mr. President, is a much larger group of players step up and say we need to reduce our footprint, we need to invest in renewable energy, we need to support putting a cap on carbon, and we need to financially put money into renewable energy so we could build an enterprise. I mean, we're seeing right now a slowdown in solar and wind energy companies because of our tax system. Well, what we saw was some of the largest corporations supporting the production tax credit to renew a tax credit for solar and wind, so those companies could flourish, and they are. The exciting thing is more resources are going into renewable energy, into energy efficiency, and some of the largest players in the world are taking the lead at this point.
Mayor Paes, I want to ask you one question just because I think it would be interesting particularly for the Americans who are here to hear you speak about this. I told you earlier, I've been really, every time I go to Brazil, I'm always blown away by the fact that in contrast to the highly partisan rhetoric I hear in America, I watch the debate occur over whether these dams should be built in the rainforest or they shouldn't be built because they would take down trees and displace an Indian tribe, over whether Brazil should continue to increase its sugarcane production to become more environmentally friendly on fuel or stop it because it was driving soybean farmers and cattle ranchers into the rainforest. And the thing that struck me was, unlike America, I watched people representing every single conceivable interest group sitting in small tables talking to each other as if they were intelligent human beings, as if they loved Brazil, as if they wanted something to happen, as if they all knew there was absolutely no such thing as a perfect solution. So suppose tomorrow you're a dictator and you can, and you can move all these poor people out of their shanties on the side of the hill. You never have to worry about their children being killed by being washed down the hill in a flood. How would you go about, what process would you undertake to go about relocating them, and how would you finance it? Because these are the kinds of problems that we're all going to have to face in the years ahead. There are going to be a lot of these no perfect, no win for everybody solutions.
Well, I mean, I'd rather speak in like the Brazilian environment these days, which is democracy, transparency, free press, which make us proud. I think Brazil took a long time to get there. I mean, to get institutions strong and consolidated. So, I mean, it's a process, and you're right, Mr. President, when you say that people want to get things done. I mean, I would say that for maybe the first time in our history, Brazil has come together and say, okay, let's get things done, and you know, stop just talking. I mean, what we didn't have for a long time was a housing policy. I mean, so you had the excuse in the past that people could go to hills and they didn't have any housing policy. But this is not the reality today. I mean, and the housing policy that we have these days in Brazil, and it works pretty good with the private sector. I mean, it's giving us the opportunity, you know, to explain to people, okay, if there's a solution for your case here, I mean, we're going to go there and do the infrastructure and all the containing of the landslides. But if there's not this chance, I mean, if things just will fall down, I mean, you have this opportunity here. I mean, you have a house to go. So, I mean, this is what we've been trying to do. A lot of discussion. I mean, and hosting these big events, such as CGI Latin America and the Olympics and the World Cup, and C40 last year, Rio Plus 20 last year, that give us even bigger opportunity to discuss about the issues in a very transparent way. So things that happens like having a C40 index and discussing these big issues of Rio, that will help us get things done.
I will say this, the mayor had said on more than one occasion today that Rio has gotten everything the world has to offer in the last few years except the Pope. And
but God
Buenos Aires got the Pope, and the mayor of Buenos Aires is here. We're glad he's here too. Mayor Bloomberg, if you could change one thing.
Mr. Clinton, yeah. God is Brazilian. The Pope is Argentinian, but God is Brazilian. Don't worry.
If you could change one thing that would make it possible for you to do all these things you've just been talking about in our area, what would it be?
Well, I think you get to the real heart of this. We all know what to do. It's the implementation. Judith talked about 2 out of the 5 communities in the Rockaways not wanting sand berms built up. and they suffered enormous amount of damage. But the truth of the matter is lots of people don't want sand built up. They don't want jetties because it moves sand from their beach, or from their beach to your beach. A lot of them, we got criticized for having our boardwalks taken away. Every place we had cement boardwalks, they survived. Every place we used hardwood, which has its own problems, we don't want to take that out of Latin America. But every place there was wood, gunzo, and so we're rebuilding with cement, but it's very controversial. They all want to rebuild all of the comfort stations so people on the beach can use comfort stations, except that now by FEMA regulations and by common sense, we're building them up high. That blocks the view. Wait a second, I didn't want that. And incidentally, we have to raise our houses, but if Judith raises her house next to mine and blocks my view, there's likely to be a fire late at night. It's just the real world of having everybody work together. We have the governor of New York came up with a plan to buy out people that don't want to yet to flesh it out, but it requires everybody in an area to be willing to sell, and one person doesn't. And there are people who want to live on the beach. I have an employee who told me her family's had a house in Breezy Point since the 30s. They've been flooded out 7 times. And she says, what's the problem? You live on the beach, you're going to get flooded out. People want to live on the beach. They used to because it was the food supply. Now they want to live on the beach because that's the great American dream, to have a beachfront property. And you just have to learn to live with it. And so, in some senses, they would argue we're trying to solve a problem that they don't think's a problem. They don't want to have to comply with what FEMA's insisting on in terms of higher standards and bigger buildings. You and I had a conversation one time after Sandy about you could build big stone buildings which would withstand anything and people would have great views. But, they say, wait a second, I don't want to live in NYCHA housing and I don't want to live in that close. I want my own bungalow. We've had it in the family forever. I want my own house where I can go and build it. And a lot of the stuff is built outside of the building code, but that's just the real world. And so for us to go in and say, this is what you got to do to protect yourself. And when we said evacuate, there's a percentage of the people that did not evacuate. Some paid the ultimate price, but it's the implementation of the things. We're here talking about what we should do, and then when push comes to shove, unless you can make it in people's economic interest, which is, Ruth, you guys, Mandy talked about, getting them to actually do it is a very different thing.
Judith, I'll give you the last word.
Well, just one thought as I was listening to Mayor Bloomberg. If you go back into the history of what made the smoking cessation movement, at least in the United States, work, after we had Surgeon General's report after Surgeon General's report showing that it was risky to health, the final tipping point was really secondhand smoke, and showing what you did influenced my health outcome. And I really think that this is another area, the area of changing behaviors with regard to climate and resilience and mitigating these risks, that may really take that realization. It may no longer be your right to decide to build X if you're violating my opportunity to reduce my own risk. And I think we are reaching a point where that will happen, and I think it will allow us to be at that tipping point and maybe really significantly change behavior.
I thought, thank you for saying that. I thought the secondhand smoke studies, to me, made the most important point we have to make in the 21st century world, which is that we are interdependent, whether we like it or not, and we cannot afford to ignore the consequences of what we do or fail to do, not only on ourselves, but on our neighbors. And I just have to say this, Mayor Bloomberg doesn't have a long time in office, but when he did that smoking ban in the restaurants, you may or may not remember, I remember like it was yesterday, everybody screamed about it and said, gosh, we were just coming out of this recession, we were hurt so bad after 9/11, this is going to drop our business another 15%, he might as well put our head in an oven. And it turned out they were all wrong. It turned out that as people liked being able to breathe in restaurants.
And they went to restaurants and they bought more drinks and they bought more food, and every restaurant benefited. And that's also the ways we're going to win the obesity thing with full sugar drinks, because in the end, you and I, we're all going to pay the health care bills for the others. And in the end, it gets it down, what's in it for me? And that's the ways to do these.
Anyway, I just wanted to thank you that, because I really do believe that in all these big conflicts and these horrible terrorist incidents and all of the stuff, the wrong answer is always premised on the fact that we have to live in a zero-sum world and our differences are more important than what we have in common. And the right answer is always premised on the fact that you don't have to like me, whether you do or not. What I do affects you. What you do affects me. We've got to figure out how to do this together. And I must say, that's why I always say, of all the rising economies, I would bet on Brazil because it has the best consultative decision-making process I have seen. They don't have to love each other or agree with everything. They just intuitively know, here's the problem, and we got to figure out what to do about it. So anyway, thank you for what you did on secondhand smoke. Thank you for what you did on firsthand smoke. And thank you all for your concern about this. This is a good beginning, and thank you for being here today. Thank you.